show. It's called Benson and Harp. Super creative name for the show. Marie was the spokeswoman for the State Department in the second term of President Obama. So she worked directly with Secretary of State John Kerry, and she joined Fox News shortly after the 2016 election as one of our liberal commentators, and I'm more conservative, but we're friends. And what's fun about it actually sort of goes to some of the themes of the book. When Fox announced that we were hiring Marie, I totally understand you want to have both sides. We had lost a few liberal commentators recently, and it's important to have a strong stable of them for balance in these debates. But I had always been very annoyed with Marie in her role at the Obama administration and what I thought was defending a bad foreign policy. And so I was a little bit, not nervous, but not necessarily eager to meet her. But the first day we met in the green room, she was very warm and came up and introduced herself. And within 5 minutes, we discovered that we both went to Big Ten colleges and are huge Big Ten football fans. So we just stood in the green room in our makeup, talking for probably 25 minutes about college football. And we hit it off. And it was just a good reminder that sometimes your impression of someone, based on what they do and who they work for and what they might believe, politics isn't everything in life. In fact, it's, I think, too much in life, too often. So we're going to be doing that show together, which I'm really excited about. My other collaboration with a fabulous woman is this book, End of Discussion, with Mary Catherine, which came out in 2015. The original edition came out in 2015. We've updated it, so there's a new chapter in there in the paperback edition that came out in August, this past August, because the original book came out literally 1 week before Donald Trump announced he was running for president. So we were in our hotel rooms in New York getting ready for the media tour, like the book tour, and that afternoon, that Tuesday, we were like, all right, what's on cable news? I was like, oh yeah, Trump's doing some weird announcement, he's running for president or some joke. So we watched it, and he came down the escalator, it was all very weird. He actually paid people to come applaud for him, like he didn't have really supporters at the time. I remember very vividly that he sort of stopped in the middle of his announcement speech briefly, and his team thought he was done, so they started playing the music, and he was like, no, turn it off. And so they quickly turned off the music, and then he went on for 30 more minutes with no script. And I was like, well, this is a weird little asterisk in history. I wonder if anyone will ever remember this. And then he's the president of America in real life. So it's our publisher came to us a number of months ago. They were like, Donald Trump is president. Berkeley, California seems to be lit on fire every few weeks because of riots and protests over free speech. Maybe you guys should update the book. So we said, let's do it. The thesis of the book is that the left primarily, but not exclusively at all, is increasingly seeking to win political and cultural debates by preventing those debates from actually happening. Where the initial tactic or strategy is to disqualify the other side as bad and wrong and motivated for terrible reasons by bad things, and therefore really unworthy of serious discussion. Therefore, you lose, you're disqualified before the discussion starts. We don't think that's a very good way to go about a constructive conversation. Our very long subtitle, actually this is very not well known because of the decline in American civics education, but it is under federal law. Every conservative book must have a short, snappy title and a very long subtitle. This was the Ann Coulter Act of 1996. It was signed by President Clinton. So she sort of mastered the art of often one word. So she has she has treason, that was one of hers. Demonic was another one of hers. I think her current one that she's working on, the working title, something like Pedophiles, Why Every Leftist Should Be Burned at the Stake, or something like that. So ours is End of Discussion, How the Left's Outrage Industry Shuts Down Debate, Manipulates Voters, and Makes America Less Free and Fun. And one of the first questions we get frequently is, well, why are you pinning this all on the left? you guys are conservatives. You're talking about this outrage industry. People are like, you work at Fox News. Are you kidding me? You're going to be complaining about an outrage industry? And I say, these are fair points. And we do not argue. In fact, we explicitly argue against the notion that this is only a phenomenon on the political left. It's absolutely not. It's a human impulse, frankly, to trample things that you don't want to hear. When you are in power, people's authoritarianism sort of starts to well up, and they try to stifle dissent. This is a phenomenon throughout human history. And we specifically call out the right for engaging in end-of-discussion tactics with explicit examples, including a few examples where we indict ourselves as well. So we're not just saying some on our side are not as enlightened as we are. We tried to find examples where we contributed to the problem that we're diagnosing as well, sort of in an interest in intellectual honesty in making our case. The reason that we mostly lay this at the feet of the left is because of the amplification and legitimization advantage that liberals tend to enjoy in our culture based on their dominance of some of the big taste-making institutions culturally in our country. Academia, most of the mainstream media, and most of pop culture and the entertainment industry. So, sort of, their silencing mob has more legitimacy and more power than our silencing mob, so to speak. What we argue and we counsel in our conclusion chapter to fellow conservatives that we should not seek to escalate these outrage wars and say, well, we need to learn these tactics and use it against them and sort of get into this arms race of outrage because we think it's sort of this soul-crushing dissent and debate-stifling thing, and the way to beat that is not to emulate it and replicate it. Unfortunately, that attitude gets a lot of pushback from a lot of our fellow conservatives because, they say if you don't use the left's playbook against them and burn them with their own tactics, then it's a one-sided fight and it's a unilateral surrender. And we get it. We think part of the rise of Donald Trump and his appeal to many conservative voters was a backlash against weaponized political correctness and sort of some of this end of discussion stuff that we write about, where many people on the right have felt over the last decade culturally bullied, told that you're bad people who are hateful and bigoted and think terrible things, and if you in some cases you should lose your job, you should lose your friends, and the response to that was, well, if we're going to be bullied, we're going to hire our own bully. And they did, in the person of the president. Mary Catherine and I were pretty vocally opposed to his candidacy. But we went around and covered that 2016 race, and we talked to a lot of our fellow Republican voters. And I'd sit there, and I'd be talking like these sweet, Catholic ladies in Wisconsin or whatever. I'd be like, okay, help me here. That he's not a conservative, right? He was pro-life starting 2 days ago. I think at one point he was asked about abortion, and his answer was he was speaking about it like it was his second language. He's like, I am very for the pro-life. No, that's not so you'd go through and you'd be like, he's not a conservative. Well, yeah, maybe not, but he'd be better than the Democrats, and maybe and then you say, well, he's also a pretty bad person, right? He cheated on all of his wives and bragged about it, and he's not good, and he just insults people all the time. They're like, well, yeah, he's not perfect. We're like, yes. And you try to dig down what was it about him, and it was the fact that he was willing to get into the mud and fight hard and fight dirty and punch back at the people that they wanted to see punched back at. So when it became clear that he was going to become the nominee, Mary Catherine and I had this realization in the initial edition of our book, we warned, and we spoke all around the country in 2015 and 2016, warning our friends on the left that if you continue down this path, you are going to build resentment among a lot of people, and there's going to be a backlash. And even we had no concept of how immediate that backlash would be and how very orange that backlash would be, but here it is. And, you know, I remember very, very vividly, just after the 2016 election, having this conversation with a friend of mine who's a liberal, talking about sort of the book and whether this is a right problem or a left problem. And I think when you feel like you are culturally dominant, being concerned about sort of the outrage mob or the silencing mob is less of a problem because you're culturally ascendant, you've got the high ground. So generally the mob is at least picking on people that you don't like very much. And one of the hypotheticals that we would give during the election was like, what if Hillary doesn't win? I know it seems crazy. I know the New York Times model says there's a 98.74% chance that she's going to win or whatever it is, but let's just say, you know, the polls are wrong in, like, Pennsylvania. And all of a sudden you have a president named Donald Trump, you have an attorney general like Jeff Sessions, I don't know, and all of a sudden the people who might be in power making silencing decisions aren't so much simpatico with your worldview anymore. Might the calculus shift a little bit about whether you're alarmed by this? And, you know, there was a little bit of self-awareness starting to creep in, I think, which was good. I have enjoyed, this is a tangent, but it's worth it. I have enjoyed some of these stories about, like, lefty media organizations organizing trips from San Francisco and New York into the Midwest for their readers to, like, go meet these people who voted for Donald Trump. It's like a safari to Wisconsin, you know? Like, I got a kick out of it. It's like some of it, I think we do need to be less siloed, and we need to meet people who think differently and not just caricature them off as the other, but, like, it was kind of funny. Like, I was imagining, like, like people writing letters home to San Francisco, like from the old, like, Western frontier. It's like, dearest secular domestic partner, morale is low here in Oconomowoc. Tonight we dined at something called TGI Fridays. It was grotesque. But it does, that need, or at least the feeling that there was a need for, like, oh shit, maybe we should go learn about people. This would have been great for Hillary to, like, visit Wisconsin, for example. Go learn about people who are not in your bubble. I think that would be one of the ways to help reduce this problem. And that's one of the tensions, and I'll stop rambling. She'll get here eventually. I'll stop rambling, and we'd love to answer questions and talk about whatever. But when we're grappling with how to make this problem better on both sides, one of the tensions that we struggle with is, you know, we both went to journalism school. We're both, you know, proud of the institution of journalism, even though it has definite flaws. And we do not look fondly back on the old days of ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, and the Washington Post basically deciding what the news was, right? We think it's great that there's talk radio and Fox News and all of these blogs and Twitter and Facebook, and, you know, we're a little too old for Snapchat, I think. I don't quite understand it. And this is one of the things that definitely makes me feel old. One of the things that really made me feel old was we had an intern at Town Hall who we were talking about social media, and he was just like, oh, I'm not on Facebook. None of my friends are on Facebook. Only old people are on that. I'm like, oh. I came out when I was in college, and it was the new hotness. And they were like, yeah, no, we send each other messages that disappear after 6 seconds. I'm like, great, that sounds like a good way to communicate. But we are in favor of the diversification and the democratization of media and more platforms and more conversation. We think that's good and healthy. But with the good comes potential downsides, and one of the downsides that we have definitely seen is sort of stratification of America. There's a really interesting book called The Big Sort about this phenomenon where, because people now have the ability to do so, they just sort of cultivate an echo chamber for themselves, where they consume only the media that they are predisposed to already agree with. So they hear the same arguments over and over again from one vantage point, and sometimes are completely unaware of stories that exist in the other universe. And it is wild sometimes watching my network and then her network, like flipping back and forth. These are both cable news channels in America in 2018, and it is like they are covering two different planets sometimes. And when you get so engrossed in one of those echo chambers, it makes it a lot easier to get involved in this sort of lazy thinking where you assume the worst about the other side, where you caricature the other side, where it's easy to just, and again, I don't think this is human nature, where, like, to otherize people, saying, well, they think differently and they would have voted for Hillary Clinton, so there must be something wrong with them, they must be mentally defective in some way, they must hate the country. Or to say, there must be something wrong with these weirdo deplorables, just to pick a word, who voted for Donald Trump. They must hate brown people. They must hate women. And when those are the assumptions that get built up, yeah, you're not going to have a constructive conversation about tax policy or healthcare policy. You're going to have just a shit show of motive imputing attacks. So we wrote the book with a slightly provocative title from a right-leaning perspective, with the goal of fostering the types of conversations that we think need to happen about our conversation, which is sort of meta and annoying sounding. But to me, so we got some nice, like, on the back of the book, in this new edition, we got a nice endorsement from Mark Levin, who's a very conservative talk show host who's sort of like very angry all the time. He yells a lot. Like one of his catchphrases is "Get off the phone, you big dope." That's a regular occurrence, and that's just him talking to his own mother. But he liked the book, and then we also have a favorable little blurb from the New Yorker. They liked the book. I think my most prized review of the book, though, came from an Amazon reviewer. I believe his name was Jim. Don't hold me to that. Jim began his Amazon review of End of Discussion by disclosing that he is of the political persuasion that believes that MSNBC is a very right-wing channel. So I'm like, I will have some of whatever he's having, because that is powerful, powerful drugs. But so yeah, he's like, MSNBC is right-wing corporatist. I'm like, okay. But he gets into the review, and he says, after reading the book, quote, "Benson and Ham are not monsters." And I was like, oh, I thought that was really touching. But that is, like, we want to put it, like, we thought about putting that on the cover of the new edition. Not monsters, raves Jim in Iowa. But I think that's indicative of part of the problem, where there is, we do it and they do it, this baseline of the other people aren't just misguided or wrong or have the incorrect prescriptions of how to get to improving the country. It's these are monstrous people who have to be defeated by any means necessary. And that means, those means may be storming into lectures and shutting them down and lighting things on fire in protest of speakers. And the type of absurd carrying on that we do on our side. Well, one more small example I'll give is a few months ago, 6 months ago, something like that, there was a whole kerfuffle at Google that you may have read about, where there was an engineer at Google who wrote an internal memo in this area of Google where they encourage their employees to write memos criticizing the culture of the company. So he wrote a memo criticizing the culture of the company, arguing that it was too politically correct, too left-leaning, too insular, and he was also making some controversial, but not offensively phrased, arguments about why there are a shortage of women in STEM type of professions in engineering. This memo was leaked and made public. He was turned into this pariah, and he was fired by Google. So he was like, I think we have an insular, politically correct culture. They're like, bullshit, you're fired. And so Mary Catherine and I were like, yeah, this is exactly the problem. And people on the left all of a sudden are super in favor of, the rights of private companies and the free market. They're like, they have every right to fire him. Like, yeah, they have the right to fire him. That doesn't mean that it's right to fire him, especially a big company that has access to all of our information. Google could absolutely destroy my life if they wanted to. I honestly feel like Mark Zuckerberg could win the presidency if he just said, vote for me or I will release everyone's DMs. And then it'd be like, okay, Mr. President, congratulations. But a bunch of conservatives were like, yeah, this is an outrage, Google, big tech, and they're firing this guy, and it's weaponized political correctness, and it's ended discussion, and you're so right. And then a few weeks later, Trump comes out, and he's just like, these sons of bitches who are kneeling during the anthem, they should fire their asses. And the same conservatives were like, woo, fire them! And we're like, no, this is the same thing. And the conservatives came in like, it's a private institution. The NFL can do whatever it wants. They have every right to do it. We're like, yes, and it's wrong to do. Don't you see it's the same thing? And they don't, in too many cases. So it's like this zero-sum blood sport. And both sides adopt these tactics and justify it when it suits their momentary need or their momentary urge to punish or purge. That rhymed, that was great. But ultimately we think it's a very unhealthy direction for the country to be headed, and we're worried that like people our age-ish and younger are sort of moving past the mentality of a quote that was attributed to Voltaire, but it's not really him. I may disagree with what you have to say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. And it's morphing into something like, I disagree with what you have to say, and therefore you need to be re-educated or punished. And there's been this weird, creepy, Orwellian conflation of speech and violence, where objectionable speech or potentially objectionable speech is presented as tantamount to a form of violence, which in some extreme cases is then perversely twisted to justify actual violence to shut down speech. But it's also an end of discussion tactic to basically say your thoughts and words are dangerous and violent, and therefore they have no place here. And one of the core concerns that we have is not the notion that some things ought to be out of bounds. I think that there is and there should be some sort of consensus about like the N-word, right? Okay, I think we should all be like, yeah, that's out of bounds in America, right? That's just straight up racism. It's taking that visceral reaction and expanding it further and further out into sort of putting up the posts of acceptable discourse and constricting what that is, and enforcing it sort of ruthlessly. That is not helpful, and I think it also breeds a sort of resentment that then leads to a lot of people deciding to go down a path and support certain candidates or even flirt with certain movements like the alt-right or whatever that otherwise would have been marginalized and fringe and irrelevant, that suddenly have more potency because of this anger over the end of discussion phenomenon. So I'll stop there. When MK rolls in, she can maybe add a couple things. We go into triggering and privilege and microaggressions and all that sort of stuff, safe spaces to some extent in the book. I do think one of my favorite elements of the book is when we talk about microaggressions, we quote an Ivy League professor who devoted his life, his professional life, to the study of microaggressions. And we're just like, this guy must be a blast at parties. And he warns in his research that sometimes the microaggressions involve insults so subtle that neither party fully understood what just happened. So we're like, oh, be on the lookout for that. And I'll wrap up with this. There's a lot of sort of dunking, like the right likes to dunk on the left on some of this stupid, like, safe space stuff, and snowflakes, melt the snowflakes and all that. And we share that same kind of disdain for weaponized, out-of-control political correctness. What we're trying to argue, especially to our fellow conservatives, is fetishizing anti-political correctness is also, in some ways, contributing to this same problem. Because at some point that devolves into just rudeness. And we don't think that being provocative for the sake of provocation, rudeness for the sake of rudeness, that's not our values. That shouldn't be our values. It's like conservatism, because assholery is free speech. That's not going to attract a bunch of people. And we argue maybe we would be better off going back to some very basic principles. One comes to mind. I think this was written down somewhere once. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Right? I feel like that's something it's a type of insight that might sell a lot of books. And we sometimes tell that joke. We told that joke at Yale, and there was just dead silence in the room. And we're like, it's the Bible. Oh, yes, the Bible. Yes, we have read of this book. But legitimately, the golden rule, we might be a lot better off. There's a kernel of truth, behind all of the excesses of the end of discussion left, microaggressions. The truth there is, try not to be a jerk to people, right? Behind triggering and trigger warnings, there is such a thing as PTSD. People who've been in war, people who've been survivors of sexual assault. We shouldn't act like nothing can ever trigger anyone. We just shouldn't expand the principle to the point that it means nothing. Privilege, right? I think it is a valuable thing for someone who looks like me to have the self-awareness to say, while I am discussing issues with people who come from different backgrounds than I do, look differently than I do, to acknowledge that for all of human history, people who look like me have had an immense position of privilege, sometimes to the exclusion or explicit subjugation of other people. To deny that while sort of chuckling at the privilege stuff is a mistake. I think being self-aware and aware of history and where people can come from very different places helps have a better conversation. What I argue is the problem is when it's well, your white privilege means that your opinion doesn't matter as much anymore, or it isn't as welcome anymore because you had your say, and it's our turn. That's where you lose me. So I'll probably just wrap it there for now, and then Mary Catherine's going to come in and use a lot of these jokes. We've done this a lot back. Actually, she has her own set of jokes. She has some very good jokes, and plus, I get all the good ones because patriarchy. With that, if you guys have any questions about the book, the thesis, or just whatever, politics, I hear there's some interesting politics going on in this state right now. There's a governor who's hitting women and cheating and all sorts of horrible things. Yeah, so any questions about anything?
I've got plenty, but does anyone else have anything they would like to talk about?
So one thing, yeah. So I think I mean, I'm interested about this radio show and how it goes, but I think some of it too is the modeling. We're an academic institution, and so some of it is if we're going to have these healthy dialogues, we're going to have to kind of model it in some way that people actually tune in or have access to it, because it doesn't have the splash or the attraction of two people yelling at each other. Like, oh, that's kind of fun. Like, let's watch this like vocal fight, you know, as
Right.
opposed to two people who are sitting civilly and like are educated about their ideas, agree to disagree, and you know, exchange, you know, points of view, but it doesn't devolve into us just yelling at each other, and you know. But unfortunately, sometimes those kind of discussions aren't what people want to watch. They want to watch us two yelling at each other and fighting, and
Yeah.
it's going to be so polemical and things like
Totally, and that, like, so, that sort of reminds me, like, sometimes I'll get questions of, like, alluding to what I did earlier, like, aren't you part of the problem? You're a pundit who works at Fox News. And my argument is, I'm not told how to argue or what to argue ever, and so I try to bring my own approach to the air, and, like, yes, sometimes cable news has really crappy incentives and bad conversations, right? She and I try to do things a little bit differently and to model things. That doesn't mean that we're perfect.
Right, right.
Like, I'll occasionally whip out the snark like anyone else, but like, I try not to be like, well, you know, and therefore you hate America. Drop the mic. And so, the other thing, and this is, there's no easy solution to the problem for what you've laid out here. The incentives are difficult. So, you know, someone I get asked about a lot is this guy named Milo Yiannopoulos. Okay, he's like this alt-right, British, flamboyantly gay cartoon character of a person, and he was like big into Trump, and it was like he's a colorful character. And so he gets invited places, and he has said some like really offensive stuff purposely through the years for the purpose of offending people. And he draws giant protests and sometimes riots, and then massive crowds of people. You know, 2,000 people in the largest venue on campus. And then Mary Catherine and I will come to the same campus, and we'll have a decent crowd, 150 people. We'll have really good Q&A, and it'll be respectful, but sometimes heated, but in a good way. And it's like, well, it's like a factor of 10 will show up to that versus this. You know, part of that is, you know, we wish that groups would be more selective about who they decide to invite. Taking ourselves out of the equation, like, you don't have to give Milo a platform. I think once someone has been invited, that invitation and it's accepted, that speaking engagement needs to be protected, even if you think the person's odious. But like, just because he pisses off the snowflakes doesn't mean that it's wise for the college Republicans to bring the snowflake melter who's going to show up and not convince a single person, right? Like, when he goes around representing our side, and like, a woman got up to ask him a question and she identified as a lesbian, and he cut her off and told her there's no such thing as lesbians. It's just women who need a man who's more sexually skilled, to put it much more politely than he did. Not a single person is being like, almost no one is being won over by that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's not just like, I don't know, influencers, that's the worst term in the world, but like, it's not just influencers who have to model better behavior, it's also just everyone. Just the number of people who lose friends online, defriend people, block people, like family members, friends, because of political disagreements, people who won't even have conversations with each other because they can't go 1 second without assuming bad motives or imputing bad motives. I think some of it just has to be modeled in our everyday life, in real life, and also in our online presence. Because generally people are usually less crazy in person, usually, than they are online. And sometimes they're equally crazy, like the president. I'm not saying he's actually mentally unwell, in case anyone's reporting this. I just think he has a very interesting way of communicating. Yeah.
So you said that there are certain things that are out of bounds.
Yeah.
You know? Ideally, how would we decide on what those things are and enforce that, whatever, I know.
Yeah, that is one of the hardest questions, and that's one of the best questions to ask. And I wish that was the type of question that we were grappling with. Hey, he's here! Woo! Actually, I'm going to hand this question off to Mary Catherine.
What is it?
The question is, it's a very easy one. As a society, how do we actually determine what things should be out of bounds and beyond the pale, and enforce that without getting into the nonsense of like end discussion-y silencing?
Yeah, I mean, look, part of this is all going to be a tug of war, and you're going to be having this constant negotiation, and that's one of the reasons that being able to discuss things is important, because if you just start arbitrarily drawing too many lines, then you can't actually continue to have the discussion, as I'm sure you've been talking about. My tendency is just to say that there are a couple things that we sort of universally agree are out of bounds. Vile racism being one of them, but that we shouldn't be anxious to create as many lines as possible. We create lines for basic decency, but not for no, you may not say that, or no, that cannot be allowed within my hearing, or no, that's against the law, for instance. A lot of people want to make hate speech against the law. And so I think being eager to draw those lines actually creates a less healthy environment, because people then are afraid to speak. Particularly, I would say, Guy noted earlier today to somebody who was talking to us, the irony of the fact that really freewheeling speech actually benefits marginalized communities, because the powerful cannot shut you down, and if the powerful are making decisions about shutting people down, you never know who the powerful are going to be at any given moment, and that creates danger for the minority speech. And so I just think being eager to clamp down is the wrong strategy, and setting boundaries that are way, way, way out here.
And eager to be offended. Like there's a whole industry of people like greedily waiting for the next thing that they can be furious about and like get someone kicked out of their job. Like it's like a self-perpetuating like weird. People get off on this, and it's like scalp collecting, and then like, well, if they collected these scalps, let's go collect those scalps. And this is probably a microaggression to Native Americans talking about scalps, but like, so I apologize and I self-flagellate for that, but there is way too much like professional, institutionalized outrage and offense taking with very little grace. Being like, oh, that came out wrong, I'm sorry. Oh, that's cool. What did you mean? Let's keep talking as opposed to, nope, this was the soundbite that you said, you're done. And we're gonna beat the drum until you're done. It's that mentality that seems to be ascendant on some level.
And I will say on the flip side, because some people ask me about, it's our job basically to get yelled at in public all the time, and called whatever it is Twitter people want to call us. And unfortunately, practice does make perfect. It doesn't bother me that much anymore. But that is not something that everyone is required to subject themselves to be a good citizen, right? Because some people ask me, like, well, at what point am I obligated to like walk away from a conversation because somebody's being abusive? Like there is a line in your personal life to keep your sort of your equilibrium and your emotional health, to say like, no, I don't think this is going anywhere. But that moment that Guy's talking about, I think is what we're losing, where someone maybe takes the wrong step in a conversation and we just say like, whoa, you kind of hurt my feelings there, and the person goes, oh, I didn't mean it that way, here's how I actually meant it. Let's focus back on the policy or whatever the thing is we were talking about. We are sort of losing that ability.
And just one more thought on this. It's the expansion. It's the abuse and expansion of the core evil that is a huge part of the problem. So like, straight up racism is the core evil, right? And when you start saying, well, you support voter ID laws, which I think disproportionately impacts communities of color and their ability to vote, and so that's kind of in the same boat as core racism, then you start watering down what racism means, and drawing those bright lines becomes much more of an ideological or partisan exercise. Like, straight up misogyny, right, is the core evil. Saying, well, you don't support women's rights on reproductive health or whatever they want to say, that's a form of misogyny. You're anti-woman.
You're just in this bucket.
Right, that's an abuse of the concept. Homophobia, like bigotry against LGBT communities, bad, not okay. Saying, well, I'm not sure that a small business photographer owned by evangelical Christians or devout Muslims should be forced to serve or participate in a gay wedding, like, that's not the same thing as, like, core bigotry. And I think it's those escalations of what counts as the evil or violent thing that becomes slippery.
Shouldn't there be like some movement in that stuff when you say there's some things now that are like unacceptable to say that maybe
Sure,
20
yeah.
years ago? So how does that happen though? Like how could we make those changes without people saying, oh well you're changing too fast or you know whatever? But like sometimes it should change. Sometimes
Yeah, but I think
I just don't want to end up on the wrong side of history. You know I don't know.
totally. There's a right. I don't think it's always clear what the right side of history or the wrong side of history is. In some cases, it's abundantly clear, right? Like it is a good thing, right, that the Nazis lost, right? I think we're all going to agree on that one. But to say, for example, to take my most recent example, like gay marriage, right, which was illegal virtually everywhere not that long ago, and opposed as a matter of public policy by both political parties. And then the argument that a lot of gay rights advocates made, which was a very successful one, an appealing one, which was, look, we just want to be treated equally. Our love does not affect you or your life or your marriage. More people started to be more publicly gay, and so people got to know gay people, and some of those, like the fear of the unknown or the confusion of the unknown started to diminish, and some of those barriers came down, and public opinion started shifting. And I think it is a dangerous thing, an escalation well beyond proper historical progress, to specifically argue, 1 minute, we just want to be treated the same, this doesn't affect you, live and let live, very libertarian, appealing to people's sense of fairness. And then as soon as you get the high ground, politically or culturally, it's like retribution time. Where if you still believe the thing that was the consensus view 7 minutes ago,
We can just call it Barack Obama's view.
Barack Obama's view, which was we're actually for gay marriage, then against gay marriage, then back in favor of gay marriage. If you followed his trajectory on his timeline, it's golden. If you're on Mike Huckabee's timeline, you know, it's unacceptable, and you're like this knuckle drag. Like Cory Booker, a senator, was screaming this week at Mike Pompeo during their hearings about Mike Pompeo's traditional views on marriage. And like Pompeo had the exact same public policy position on gay marriage as Hillary Clinton did when she was confirmed for the same position in 2009. And I just think it doesn't seem like in some cases, a good faith effort to bring society to a better place, but rather to punish the people that you don't like by enforcing a new ideological regime. And I think the experience of the gay rights trajectory is it's a lot better to persuade people and win hearts and minds on things than to rigidly and ruthlessly enforce something, especially when it's happened so quickly. And last point on this, the sea change on, and we write about this actually a little bit in the book, the sea change, because people say social issues and they lump abortion and gay rights, usually those are the big social issues. And there's an assumption that they're kind of the same. People who believe one thing, like you can predict what people believe about gay marriage based on what their position on abortion is. And the data shows that is increasingly not true, especially among young people, where, you know, there was a very controversial Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, that settled the issue of abortion, and it is still deeply divisive, and hundreds of thousands of people march every January still in protest of that decision decades later. Whereas Obergefell, the gay marriage decision, happened and public opinion has dramatically shifted, especially among Republicans on the issue. Cultures and views shift and change and evolve over time. I think the mistake is the arrogance that both sides have, but the left is super arrogant on this stuff, of assuming that the right side of history is always towards them and progress, which is their ideas, which in some cases correct and in some cases are not. And rather than making these existential sort of scoldy arguments about justice and being on the right side of history, like, make a proactive, substantive case for your views and why they're better.
And one thing that we noted in the book is when it comes down to sort of all these limitations on speech or who you can hang out with in order to sort of prove that you're down with the cause or whatever the thing is at the moment. For instance, there were two gay hotel owners who had dinner with Ted Cruz, and for this great sin, there was like on their vacation, somebody hired a skywriter to say something about it. They were kicked out of several bars. It was like this very open.
Their hotel was boycotted.
Yes, they were ostracized.
There's
Yeah.
an AIDS benefit was canceled at the hotel
Because they had dinner with Ted.
because they had dinner with Ted Cruz. I'm like, yeah, sorry, AIDS patients.
Yeah.
Suck it, Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz is going to suffer them.
Yeah.
But the point being, having two gay men sit down with Ted Cruz and have dinner with him, during which they might agree on some foreign policy issues and economic issues, but then disagree on gay marriage, is actually a wonderful opportunity to talk to a powerful person in public policy who might have an influence on changing culture and policy toward the direction you want to change it. And if you make it impossible for people to do that without losing their cred and without having their being punished and having their lives just to some extent really disturbed or destroyed, or livelihoods disturbed or destroyed, then you lose the opportunities to actually move culture in the direction that you'd like to. And so I think that's a lot of what I'm concerned about too.
If these people are evil and wrong, and you are not to speak to them, and you are not to
Which
dine
means they
with
will
them,
remain.
like it's like active enforcement of this very weird form of, like, I don't know, just separation. I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
Got a question. So we're all med students. So do you have any advice for navigating the healthcare debate? It's like one side, you don't like poor people. The other side, you're a dirty communist. It's like, how do you get away from that and like have a good conversation about it without getting so out there? What do you think?
Hasn't been happening because because healthcare is so personal. Those debates get very volatile, and if you do not believe the thing that you're supposed to believe, it goes straight to, like, you want people dead, right? So that's the ultimate end of discussion debating tactic. Like, oh yeah, you want me dead. Like, there's nowhere to go from there. Go ahead.
I would say that as medical students and as people who do work in the healthcare industry, you're perfectly positioned to see trade-offs of public policy. There are always trade-offs of public policy. It is not black and white. It is not everyone's going to suffer if we do it this way and everyone's going to benefit if we do it this way. And that was one of the, I think, the great strategic mistakes of the Obama administration in arguing for the overhaul was every single person will benefit. There will be no losers. And like, that was never true. I was one of the people who argued that that wasn't true. I also ended up being one of the losers. And so I've lived through both parts of that. I also have friends whose literal lives were saved by being in a different healthcare system post-Obamacare, right? Both of those people exist. And actually, we have dinner together frequently. So I think being in a position to recognize the ups and downsides of any given policy can make you a fairer observer of these things. It can make you a bit more of a rational part of the debate, and to acknowledge that I think one of the things we miss is just acknowledging that there are going to be two parts of any change. That can make it healthier just on space to acknowledge that that exists. And you guys will be in a perfect position to see that in any given case. And you can make the argument like, look, I think this is overall the better case. But yeah, I think when we get into a position of saying, this is what will work perfectly for everyone versus this, which will destroy everyone, that is not a healthy debate. And you guys can be, I think, really influential in that way.
And this goes back to the echo chamber. That's coming full circle to where we started. In the Obamacare debate, it was fascinating, and we've both gone through this at our respective networks, where we'll be discussing Obamacare and Obamacare repeal or single payer and all of these discussions. And I will make the case, I was adamantly opposed to Obamacare. I think it's a bad law. I will acknowledge in my discussions on air and in writing that there are people who have been helped by Obamacare. And I will get tweets from our viewers, some of our conservative viewers who are like, no one has been helped by Obamacare.
Impossible.
And I'm like, they're like, it's a disaster and it's hurt everyone. I'm like, no, that's not true. Like, I think you can make an empirical case that the people who have been harmed outnumber the people who have been helped, and that's a really lousy way to make policy. But we can't pretend like there are not beneficiaries, and if you're going to uproot something that has helped save some people's lives, they're going to have a problem with that, right? Then she'll make the case that Obamacare has harmed millions of people, and people flood into her timeline, calling her a liar, and saying that these cases don't exist, even though she is literally one of them. Like, she had her health care canceled, her plan canceled 5 times?
Four times.
4 times, including just after her husband passed away, like cancellation letter.
While I was 8 months pregnant.
While she was 8 months pregnant. The thing that you would never lose your plan or your doctor. If you like them, you can keep them. Someone said that about 1,000 times. And it wasn't true. And then her premiums and deductible shot up immensely.
Like, people just don't believe that exists because they've signed on to the tribe that says this doesn't exist.
So they accuse her of lying. And they go like dead husband truther on her, like, that's not true. I know what healthcare you had because I know what job you had, and it's wrong.
It's crazy stuff.
But it's like they're jumping through hoops and attacking her as a widow.
They're like pulling up premium charts from 2009. Like, you couldn't have been. I'm like, all right, y'all. I promise I'm not lying.
And so that goes to the trade-off thing.
Yeah.
And not everything is terribly black and white, especially in healthcare policy. And if in your introductory little manifesto about your organization, it's more manifesto's wrong. I was about to praise it. Like focusing on the patient-doctor relationship, focusing on free market solutions, but also fostering actual productive conversations. Like, you guys are uniquely positioned to have credibility as medical students and then eventually doctors to come out and talk about what the trade-offs are and why you believe what you believe, and be less blowhardy than cable news pundits, such as ourselves.
Low bar.
Yeah.
Low bar.
Cool. Thank you guys so much for having us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
If it were not for the patriarchy, I would have been here earlier, but they don't build in time for me to do my hair. And so I did have to, after the plants spruce up. So I apologize for being late. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
I know. I did make a patriarchy joke earlier.
Yeah.
As long as I'm not here, you should.
Glad you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I'm late. Yeah, thanks for having me. Sorry I was late.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're all president.
Thank you so much. This was fun. Sorry I didn't get here.
It's okay.
Nice to meet you.
You never know how people spell their names.
It's the big medicine. One other one, too, David.
It's May 7th. Sweet. It'll be available like
it's different.
The big problem still.
This is for you.
Oh, great.
We got another one. You guys, I know you guys together like this. We got another book, guys. It's by a nurse who's working.
Alright, cool.
Interesting. Okay, yeah.
Cool.
I'm interested in this stuff because of you, because I've lived through all the. I stay.
My
I stay
brother,
up to date.
and this is like a.
Yeah.
But it's like a
Cover
Look
art.
at that.
Yeah,
Look at that stare from that handsome doctor.
he's very regal.
Yeah.
But I guess it's like a novel.
Okay.
But it
this is-
touches on like free market.
Hear about
It touches on free market stuff. So
I love
hopefully
it.
you guys
I love
You're hitting all of her.
I'm gonna read it.
Doctor and free market.
Milton Friedman's on the back. Hello.
Wait, did he blurb it?
No, it's just about like government
What's this
stuff.
advanced praise for double vision?
It's been great.
You're right. Bye, Milton Friedman. Okay.
Okay.
I'm out.
Yeah. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, this was fun.
I'm
Yeah,
out.
we had a.
Yeah. Glad you guys. This is our first event, so you guys
Yeah.
broke us in as this is for the
What's
new
the
leadership.
latest- what's the
Well,
latest
my
tech?
first day here
Nice to meet you. Hey.
under us, so.
Yeah, first time under us.
Sweet.
And we put together something, so you guys
I thought it was a
broke.
very nice turnout.
It was a great turnout. There was free food, which always helps.
Yeah.
It helps, and we like people hang out in the library all day. We send an email like 30 minutes before food down here, and we're having another, we're having an event. So I think we're like.
I try to make a lot of eye contact around the room and like gauge if people are like on board or not on board or at least engaged. And everyone was
like
engaged.
he seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got a few skeptical faces that did laugh at some of my jokes. I'm like, that's all I ask.
That's all I ask.
Please just laugh at my jokes. It's fine.
Yeah.
Not monsters.
Not monsters.
I don't think so.
I love
That wasn't my
my blurb.
It's the best.
It's the best blurb.
You really should put that on the cover.
We're
That'd be great.
yeah.
Random dude on Amazon.
Yes.
They're not.
Jim from Amazon raves.
Monsters.
Sweet. So where are we?
He's gonna pull the car up right here. And then we're gonna.
Oh, great. Cool.
Cool.
We're
Thanks,
just
guys.
heads
Thank you. We are speaking to the Show Me Institute, which is like a conservative think tank in the state. So we're doing their like keynote happy hour thing. We are absolutely going to be drinking on stage.
Absolutely.
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 Oh,
Do
definitely.
you know where to go?
No, I think we'll just head
I
out.
think so. We're just gonna head out
Out the
this
front, right?
exit and then
Yeah,
pull
you go
the
to
car
the
up,
right,
I think.
pull
And by the way, thank you for your question because that is like such an important and difficult question, and it's often a question that we never get to in these things because a lot of people on the right are sort of like, yeah, we agree with you, and this all sucks. And people on the left are like, you know, how like a question that I get. I was at Brown recently, and the first question was, so I'm gay. First question was basically justify your existence as a gay conservative. How can you do this to your own people? And so like we're not getting anywhere close to like the actual heart of what the acceptable boundaries ought to be. I think the reason that we wrote the book is that the acceptable boundaries or what they're trying to set up as those boundaries are so deeply out of whack
They're like
and
here.
unfair that it's a huge problem. And I think a great place that we might get to if all of our dreams came true were to have the actual discussion about, okay, we've beaten back the crazy, now let's talk about what is fair and what isn't fair. There's so much unfair right now that we're trying to like defeat that. And then that will lead us to, I think, a better conversation about the core issue that you raised, which is the key one. So, awesome.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
We'll see ya.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Right.
Yeah, no, but actually, that's a good
forget
question.
it.
That was-
I also struggle with that all the time. You know, like I tell you, like, like
Said that was your first event, that would be a hard first event.
Oh, what's that?
We got something in the channel.
like, at this point, this is some kind of person.
They meant that he's really government. So they say that Israeli people like.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Like they know what's going on.
That's always a concern. Like, I hope.
But that's their opinion. I don't think that wouldn't be. That's not the core. The core he's talking about is that is saying like you're kind of that's the core. Outside of that, they're saying that Israel is. They're not saying you.
What if the worst case scenario was like,
It's gonna be a.
I support this. I support this league already. And they're like,
not saying you're supporting him because he.
I shared the attendance with you.
I don't think that's
so that you have reimbursement.
Like people,
I think you have to
support
send
Trump.
that to the
People
person.
say that Trump
Oh,
don't really
yeah.
get that. I don't.
Unless you use like, did you get the school that pays for it? Or did you?
I'm going to
Like,
try. I don't know if you do it retroactive. Otherwise, I
Yeah,
know
you
they'll.
can.
Okay, I'll try to do that because it's only $100.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have the receipt?
I would have friend that.
Yes, I do.
Okay, yeah. Just send that in and send the, like, I think you share the attendance form with them.
And that helps
Yeah.
them know how much